Satellite image timestamp 347 local time. A strip of agricultural track northeast of Kupiansk, running parallel to a stand of winter birch and pine, perfectly straight, perfectly channelized, on the Maxar still pulled that morning by a Ukrainian intelligence cell. 18 heat signatures are visible in column formation, spaced at irregular intervals, moving southwest along that track at roughly 12 kilometers per hour. 18 T-72B3 main battle tanks, 2 echelons, 1 narrow corridor. By 7:51, 12 of those hulls would be burning. This is the story of what happened in that 4-hour window northeast of Kupiansk, a pre-dawn armored push by elements of Russia's 1st Guards Tank Army that ended not with a breakthrough, not with a contested withdrawal, but with the systematic destruction of nearly a full tank battalion's worth of mainline armor along 2.1 kilometers of Ukrainian farmland. The weapon that did it was not artillery, it was not an airstrike. It was the Stugna-P, a Ukrainian-produced laser-guided anti-tank missile system operated by 2-man teams from the 14th Mechanized Brigade, crouched in pre-registered ambush positions they had occupied for 36 hours before the first Russian tank crossed the line of departure. How did Russian commanders commit 18 tanks to a tree-line corridor that Ukrainian forces had already ranged, mapped, and wired for destruction? And why, after 18 months of identical outcomes along identical terrain features across eastern Ukraine, does the pattern keep repeating? Stay with us for the next 34 minutes. The answer cuts to the bone of how Russia's armored force actually functions and what it cannot change, even when the cost is catastrophic. The Kupiansk axis in the Kharkiv direction has been one of the most consistently contested stretches of the entire front since Russian forces were expelled from the city in September 2022. The town sits at the junction of the Oskol River and the main rail line connecting Kharkiv to Luhansk, making it one of the most logistically significant points in the northeastern theater. Whoever controls Kupiansk and its rail infrastructure controls the ability to supply forces across a roughly 150-kilometer arc of front line. Russia has understood this since the beginning. Its repeated attempts to recapture, or at least threaten Kupiansk, have consumed significant resources across multiple brigades over more than 2 years of fighting. By late autumn of the previous year, Russian forces in the Kharkiv direction had been progressively grinding against Ukrainian defensive lines northeast of the city, attempting to establish fire control over the approaches and, where possible, to push forward observation posts and advance positions. The 1st Guards Tank Army, formerly the 1st Tank Army, one of the most prestigious formations in the Russian order of battle, headquartered in the Moscow military district before the war, had elements committed along this axis as part of a broader rotational pressure campaign. Its subordinate units, including the 2nd Guards Tamanska Motor Rifle Division and associated armored elements, had appeared repeatedly in OSINT imagery and intercepted communications throughout the Kharkiv direction. The specific terrain northeast of Kupiansk that concerns us here is a stretch of partially frozen agricultural land bisected by a single improved track running southwest to northeast. On the eastern side of this track, a mature tree line of mixed birch, pine, and scrub runs for approximately 2.8 kilometers before breaking into open fields. On the western side, open ground extends several hundred meters before reaching the next terrain feature, a low ridgeline that Ukrainian forces had used to site observation posts. Russian commanders looking at this terrain on a map saw something that appeared to offer concealment. The tree line along the track would screen a column from direct observation from the west. Movement in darkness through the trees toward Ukrainian defensive positions further southwest. The logic was, at minimum, comprehensible. What the map did not show What no satellite image and no staff officer's terrain assessment adequately captured was that the 14th Mechanized Brigade had been living in this terrain for weeks. Their Stugna-P teams knew every meter of that track. They had laser designated the exact points where the track narrowed, where bogged vehicles would block the column, where the tree line created a natural funnel. They had pre-registered artillery on the middle third of the 2.1-kilometer approach, and they had positioned FPV drone relay teams behind the ridgeline to the west, with line of sight to the entire length of the kill zone. Russia came to a fight that had already been decided. The question was only how many tanks would commit before the survivors understood that. Here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface. The 1st Guards Tank Army is not a provincial formation staffed by poorly trained conscripts. It is, on paper, one of the most capable armored formations in the Russian military. Its lineage runs through the Second World War, through Afghanistan, through both Chechen wars. Its officers are career professionals, and yet the tactical decision that sent 18 T-72B3s down a single channelized track in the pre-dawn hours, without confirmed suppression of anti-tank systems, without engineer reconnaissance of the route, without electronic warfare coverage of the approaches, is not an anomaly. It is the standard. Ukrainian signals intelligence, operating a collection capability that has grown increasingly sophisticated over more than 2 years of full-scale war, had been tracking radio traffic associated with the assembling column for approximately 11 hours before the push began. Forward observers from the 14th Mechanized, dug into positions along the ridgeline, reported vehicle movement in the Treeline staging area beginning at approximately 22 o'clock the previous evening. The sound of T-72 engines, a distinctive turbine whine that experienced Ukrainian infantry recognize immediately, carried across the frozen fields well before the thermal signatures appeared on the Mavic 3 feeds that drone operators were running from sheltered positions 2 kilometers back. The Stugna-P teams were already in their firing positions. The Stugna-P, designated RK-3 Corsair in its export configuration, is a Ukrainian-designed and Ukrainian-manufactured laser-guided anti-tank guided missile system. It fires a 130mm tandem warhead missile capable of defeating tanks protected by explosive reactive armor. The system's effective range stretches to 5,000 meters in its extended range configuration, and its laser beam riding guidance does not emit active radar or radio frequency signatures that Russian electronic warfare systems can detect and localize. The crew, typically 2 operators, can fire from cover with only the sighting system exposed above the parapet. Ukrainian industry had ramped production of the Stugna-P significantly by this point in the war, and the 14th Mechanized Brigade had equipped its anti-tank platoons with the system across multiple companies. What Russian intelligence apparently failed to adequately assess was not the existence of the Stugna-P. Russian forces had been encountering it for years at this point. It was the density of its positioning along this specific axis and the degree to which Ukrainian operators had pre-registered their firing solutions on the terrain. The comparative picture here defines everything about what followed. Russia committed 18 T-72B3 tanks, each worth approximately $3 million, with a crew of 3 armed with a 125mm smoothbore gun and protected by Contact 5 explosive reactive armor, into a corridor covered by a system that costs a fraction of its target and that the armor cannot reliably detect before the missile is already in the air. The T-72B3, which entered service as a modernization of the Soviet-era T-72 in 2011, carries improved fire control, a thermal imaging system, and the relict ERA package in its most current variant. But its crew visibility from inside the tank remains severely limited. Its situational awareness in narrow terrain features is poor, and its ability to respond to a laser-guided missile already in flight is essentially zero. This mismatch, expensive, crew-intensive armor versus a cheap, concealed, precision-guided weapon, is not unique to Kupiansk. It is the defining tactical asymmetry of the Eastern Front. At approximately 3:52, the lead element of the Russian column crossed what Ukrainian Stugna-P teams had designated as the engagement line, the point at which the track narrowed between the tree line and a shallow drainage ditch on the western side, reducing the passable width to roughly 4 meters. This was the choke point. The first tank to reach it could be stopped. If it burned in place, the column behind it would stack up in the widest section of the approach, a killing ground 300 meters long, where every vehicle would be within range of every prepared firing position. The first Stugna-P missile was fired at 3:53. Ukrainian accounts, consistent with the visible wreckage later geolocated and cross-referenced by OSINT analysts, indicate the missile struck the lead T-72B3 in the turret ring area, the junction between the turret and the hull where ERA coverage is incomplete. The resulting fire was immediate. Secondary detonation of propellant or ammunition followed within approximately 40 seconds, producing the catastrophic brew-up that has become grimly familiar from Ukrainian drone footage across dozens of engagements. The column stopped, and that was the moment the kill zone closed. Here is what most analyses of this engagement miss. The stopping of the lead tank was not by itself decisive. Russian armored columns have lost lead vehicles before and continued the push. What made this engagement different, what turned a blocked column into a 12-vehicle catastrophe, was the speed and coordination of what came next. Within 90 seconds of the first missile strike, FPV drone operators behind the western ridgeline pushed their aircraft across the tree line. These were not improvised single-use vehicles. They were part of a coordinated relay system, pre-positioned and pre-assigned to specific target sectors along the kill zone. Ukrainian FPV teams had divided the 2.1-kilometer track into 5 overlapping sectors of fire. Each sector had a primary and a secondary drone team. The relay worked like this. The moment a vehicle in a given sector stopped moving, it was flagged for FPV engagement. Moving vehicles were left to the Stugna-P teams. Stationary vehicles, bogged, disabled, or halted by the blocking fire ahead, were handed off. The second and third tanks in the column had braked when the lead vehicle stopped. In the thermal imagery recovered later, their heat signatures are visible clustered within roughly 60 meters of the burning lead tank. An FPV drone struck the second tank at 3:56. The third was struck at 4:01 by a second Stugna-P missile fired from a position 1,800 meters to the southwest. The crew of the third tank attempted to reverse. The video of this, later published by Ukrainian military sources, shows the tank's tracks spinning on the partially frozen agricultural ground before the missile struck the left side of the hull. The column's first echelon, 9 tanks, had entered the kill zone. By 4:19, 7 of those 9 vehicles were burning or abandoned. The Russian response over the next 40 minutes tells its own story of what went wrong at the command level. Intercepted communications from this engagement, fragments of which were later published by Ukrainian military intelligence, show significant confusion in the Russian command net. Unit-level radio traffic, the kind of message a company commander sends to his battalion when his lead platoon is being destroyed in front of him, shows multiple requests for artillery support, for smoke, for any suppression of the Ukrainian firing positions. The responses were delayed. The artillery that eventually landed did so in the open field west of the ridgeline, several hundred meters from the actual Stugna-P positions, which were dug in on the eastern slope and invisible to Russian observation. One detail from those intercepts stayed with me when I first read the translations. A Russian officer, his rank and unit designation redacted in the published version, is recorded asking twice whether engineer assets can be brought forward to clear the track. The response, when it finally comes, is that engineer assets are not available at the company level. They are with the battalion. The battalion is 3 kilometers back. The second echelon of 9 tanks had halted approximately 800 meters northeast of the kill zone's entrance when the first echelon's destruction became apparent. Thermal imaging from Ukrainian drone operators shows these vehicles stationary in a loose formation at the edge of the tree line for approximately 22 minutes, long enough for the drone teams to complete engagements against stationary targets in the forward kill zone and begin repositioning. 3 tanks from the second echelon attempted to push forward at approximately 4:34. 2 were struck by Stugna-P missiles. 1 reversed successfully and withdrew northeast. By 5:10, with pre-dawn light beginning to dilute the darkness, the engagement was effectively over. What remained in the 2.1-kilometer stretch of agricultural track were 12 burning or abandoned T-72B3 hulls, 1 overturned infantry fighting vehicle, a BMP-2 that had accompanied the column and driven off the drainage ditch in the confusion, and scattered individual equipment across the frozen fields, indicating crew casualties. 6 tanks had survived the engagement, withdrawing northeast in varying states of damage. Here's the take that will probably draw some responses. The blame for this engagement does not rest primarily with the company and battalion commanders who executed the push. It rests with the operational planners who repeatedly approve this template, channelized armor assault along terrain features, without confirmed engineer route clearance, without adequate suppression of anti-tank positions, without electronic warfare coverage, and who have been approving the same template for over 2 years of identical outcomes. The company commanders who lost their vehicles northeast of Kupiansk were executing orders they did not write. The doctrine that produced those orders is the real subject of this story. What do you think? Is Russia's continued use of this tactical template evidence of institutional failure, or is there something we're missing about the operational calculus that drives these decisions? We read every comment. At approximately 6:20, a Russian recovery convoy appeared on thermal imagery at the northeastern end of the track, 2 Brem-1 armored recovery vehicles, the standard Russian battlefield recovery platform, with what appeared to be infantry escort. The Brem-1 is a tracked recovery vehicle based on the T-72 chassis, equipped with a crane and winch assembly capable of extracting disabled armored vehicles from difficult terrain. Russian ground forces depend on Brem-1 assets to recover damaged and disabled armor from contested terrain. And in this war, the ability to recover vehicles has become tactically significant, because confirmed destruction of a hull on video is the evidentiary standard that organizations like Oryx use to add it to the verified losses count. The first Brem-1 reached the burning lead tank at approximately 6:31. Ukrainian accounts indicate it was struck by an FPV drone within minutes of stopping. The drone team, which had repositioned during the pause after the main engagement, had the recovery vehicle in its sector coverage. The Brem-1 crew abandoned the vehicle. The second Brem-1, apparently recognizing the threat, did not advance and withdrew northeast shortly after. The failed recovery operation has its own significance. 2 armored recovery vehicles lost in an attempt to extract vehicles that were already confirmed destroyed. The Russian command was willing to accept additional losses to deny Ukrainian forces the propaganda value of intact, clearly identifiable wreckage. That calculus failed. The hulls remained. OSINT analysts working from drone footage and subsequently from commercial satellite imagery geolocated 12 of the 18 tank positions with high confidence, cross-referencing visible turret configurations, track patterns in the frozen ground, and hull markings visible on at least 4 vehicles in the published footage. If you've been following this war seriously, here's why this specific engagement matters beyond the vehicle count. According to open-source data compiled by Oryx and cross-referenced by multiple OSINT analysts, Russia's tank losses since February 2022 have exceeded 4,000 confirmed vehicles, a figure that, if accurate, would represent the destruction of more tanks than any other military has lost in a single conflict since the Second World War. The industrial capacity to replace those losses has been one of the central debates in the analytical community. Russia has been pulling T-62S and even T-54S from long-term storage, refurbishing them to varying degrees, and committing them alongside newer T-72B3 and T-80 variants along the front. The storage depots, subject to periodic Ukrainian strike packages, have been gradually drawn down. The 12 T-72B3 hulls lost northeast of Kupiansk represent, at Oryx's approximate valuation methodology, somewhere between $36 and $40 million in armor, before accounting for ammunition, crew training costs, and associated equipment. More significantly, they represent the near-total combat power of a tank battalion. Russian tank battalions in current TO and E, the tables of organization and equipment that define how units are structured, typically field between 30 and 40 tanks at full strength, though actual strength in theater has consistently fallen below those figures. Losing 12 tanks in a single 4-hour engagement effectively removes a battalion-equivalent armored element from the order of battle until it can be reconstituted. Reconstitution takes time. Replacement crews take longer. A tank without a trained crew is ballast. The battle damage assessment produced by Ukrainian military intelligence, later partially shared with Western defense partners, according to officials cited by multiple outlets in the weeks following the engagement, assessed 13 vehicles destroyed and 1 additional vehicle damaged beyond battlefield repair, a slightly higher figure than the 12 hulls confirmed by independent OSINT analysis, possibly reflecting vehicles that withdrew and were subsequently assessed as write-offs. Ukrainian General Staff reporting in the period following the engagement referenced significant Russian armored losses in the Kupiansk direction without specifying the exact engagement or unit. The satellite imagery sequence, the Maxar still from 347 showing 18 heat signatures in column, and the subsequent imagery from later that morning showing 12 static heat signatures in the same strip of track, is the visual record that OSINT analysts have found most compelling. The spacing of the burning hulls, the cluster of 3 vehicles near the choke point at the southern end, and the isolated positions of vehicles further northeast correspond precisely to the engagement sequence reconstructed from drone footage and radio intercepts. Historical question worth sitting with: comparable armored attrition through channelized ambush appeared in the Korean War along the mountain roads of the Central Front, in the Yom Kippur War along the Suez Canal approaches, and in the First Gulf War during the attempted Iraqi breakout from Kuwait City. In each case, the attacking force continued committing armor to a kill zone long after the tactical situation had made survival impossible, not because commanders were incompetent, but because institutional pressure to demonstrate offensive action, to maintain momentum, to not report failure to higher echelons, overrode tactical judgment. The evidence from Kupiansk suggests the pattern repeats. The specific mechanism, radio intercepts revealing delayed artillery support requests, engineer assets unavailable at company level, recovery vehicles committed to already destroyed hulls, maps closely enough onto those historical cases to suggest something systemic rather than something situational. The doctrine question is the one that Ukrainian brigade-level planners are, according to multiple analytical assessments, treating as both an advantage and a responsibility. What the 14th Mechanized Brigade demonstrated northeast of Kupiansk was not improvisation, it was industrialization. The kill chain, satellite and drone early warning, forward observer confirmation, Stugna-P engagement of moving targets, FPV engagement of stationary targets, artillery pre-registration on blocking positions, radio intercept for command and control awareness, had been rehearsed, refined, and pre-positioned. It did not depend on any single element working perfectly. If the Stugna-P teams had failed to stop the lead vehicle, the FPV teams had contingency targets. If the FPV teams had lost connectivity, the pre-registered artillery would have activated. The system was redundant by design. That redundancy, layered, interlocking, pre-positioned, is what the Russian armored assault encountered, and it is what Russian operational planning at battalion and brigade level apparently failed to model adequately before committing those 18 tanks. The most surprising part of this story isn't the destruction of 12 tanks, it's how little that destruction changed the operational tempo on the Kupiansk axis in the days that followed. Russian pressure on the northeastern approaches did not pause for a week to absorb the lessons of the engagement. It continued, with different units along adjacent terrain features, using variants of the same template. Rotational replacement of degraded units is a feature of Russian operational planning that Western counterparts have consistently underestimated. The capacity to accept loss, reconstitute, and reapply pressure without altering the underlying approach. This is where the Ukrainian challenge actually lies. The 14th Mechanized Brigade can and does attrite Russian armor at devastating ratios along the Kupiansk axis. The Stugna-P ambush northeast of the city is a case study in how effectively Ukrainian brigade-level forces have learned to manage that attrition. But attrition, even at ratios of 12-0 in a single engagement, does not by itself produce the kind of positional collapse that changes a front line. It produces a slower Russian advance, a higher cost per kilometer of territorial gain, a mounting pressure on Russian manpower and equipment pools. Whether those pressures accumulate to a decisive breaking point, or whether Russian institutional capacity to absorb and replace losses proves deeper than Western analysts have assessed, remains the open question of the entire war. Here's what this engagement tells us about the broader system. Russia's First Guards Tank Army is not a formation in crisis. It is a formation under sustained attrition, operating at the outer edge of its institutional capacity to replace experienced crew and quality equipment simultaneously. The T-72B3 hulls, lost northeast of Kupiansk, will be replaced, some of them likely already have been, drawn from storage or diverted from training units. What cannot be replaced on the same timeline is the crew experience, the tactical judgment, and the unit cohesion that burned along with those 12 tanks in the pre-dawn hours over that stretch of agricultural track. The Brem 1 crews, who drove their recovery vehicles into a still active kill zone to reach already destroyed tanks, were not making a rational tactical calculation. They were executing an institutional imperative: deny the enemy evidence, recover what you can, demonstrate that the unit is still functioning. That imperative cost 2 more armored vehicles and several more crew members. It recovered nothing. And in the drone footage published subsequently, the moment when the first Brem 1 stops moving and the crew scrambles out on the eastern side of the vehicle and runs into the tree line, that single 30-second clip tells you more about the state of Russian armored operations in the Kharkiv direction than any official assessment. Will Russia change this template? Could the First Guards Tank Army have prevented this outcome if its planning process had included confirmed route reconnaissance, dedicated electronic warfare support for the column, and pre-suppression of the ridgeline positions west of the track? Almost certainly yes, at least for this specific engagement. The tactical remedies exist and are not complex. Engineer assets forward, smoke screens, artillery suppression of likely anti-tank positions before armor commits. These are not novel concepts. They appear in Russian military doctrine manuals that date back to the Soviet era. The question is why they are so rarely implemented along the Kupiansk axis and along dozens of similar axes across the Eastern Front. What emerges from this engagement, from the intercepted communications, from the pattern of losses over 18 months, is not that Russian commanders don't know what they should do. It's that the conditions under which they're operating, rotating units, degraded NCO cadres, equipment that doesn't always perform as specified. Communication systems that Ukrainian electronic warfare regularly disrupts make the textbook approach impossible to execute, even when commanders know it's required. The gap between what Russian military doctrine says should happen and what Russian units in contact can actually execute is the real story of the Kupiansk axis. And it's a gap that Ukrainian brigade planners, like those of the 14th Mechanized, have learned to read and exploit with increasing precision. The Stugna-P teams who fired the first missiles before 4 o'clock on that pre-dawn morning had been in their positions for 36 hours. They had watched the Russian column assemble through the night on thermal imagers. They had confirmed their firing solutions. They had coordinated the FPV relay teams behind the ridgeline. They had pre-registered the blocking positions with artillery. And then they waited, cold, disciplined, invisible, for the first Russian tank to cross the engagement line. That patience, and the system that supports it, is the real weapon. The Stugna-P is the instrument. The industrialized kill chain is the method. And the decision by Ukrainian commanders to invest 36 hours of crew endurance into a pre-positioned ambush rather than committing those same assets to a mobile engagement is the doctrine. Could Russia have seen this coming? The satellite imagery that showed Ukrainian dig-in activity along the ridgeline was available in principle to Russian intelligence collection. Thermal signatures from the Stugna-P firing positions, dug in and under overhead cover, were below the detection threshold of the reconnaissance assets Russia deployed. Forward observers would have required pushing scouts into terrain already controlled by Ukrainian forces, and the last time Russian scouts had attempted that on this axis, they had not returned. How does this change what NATO planners are studying? The Kupiansk engagement has circulated through Western defense establishments not as a curiosity but as a template. The principle of pre-registered layered anti-tank ambush with coordinated drone and missile integration is not new, but the degree to which Ukrainian brigade-level forces have systematized and executed it at scale with Ukrainian-produced equipment and Ukrainian-trained crews without direct Western technical involvement in the tactical chain has genuinely impressed analysts who have reviewed the engagement details. The lesson being absorbed is not simply that Stugna-P is effective, it's that the integration of anti-tank guided missiles with FPV drone suppression and pre-registered indirect fires, coordinated at company and battalion level with minimal radio communication, produces kill zones that armor cannot breach without engineering preparation and fire support that most contemporary ground forces struggle to provide at speed. And what comes next on the Kupiansk axis? Russian pressure on the northeastern approaches has not abated. The logistical and strategic rationale for Russian commanders to continue seeking a breakthrough toward the city has not changed. The rail junction remains as significant as it was when the first full-scale push failed in 2022. What has changed is the Ukrainian defensive architecture. More pre-positioned systems, more experienced crews, more refined coordination between Stugna-P teams and drone operators and artillery elements. Every engagement that produces the kind of losses documented northeast of the city teaches both sides something. Russia learns, slowly and at great cost, where the kill zones are. Ukraine learns, faster and at lower cost, how to make the next kill zone more effective than the last. That asymmetry in the learning rate, not the asymmetry in equipment, not the asymmetry in manpower, not even the asymmetry in Western support, may be the most significant operational factor on the Kupiansk axis. It is certainly the one that the 12 burning hulls along that 2.1-kilometer agricultural track most clearly illustrate. Russia saw a tree line and a track and a pre-dawn window and calculated it as an opportunity. Ukraine saw the same terrain, pre-positioned their systems, and waited 36 hours to demonstrate that the calculation was wrong. Comment below. Do you think Russian armored commanders will adapt their approach on the Kupiansk axis before the next major push, or is this pattern locked in for as long as the current operational posture continues? We read everything. The wreckage along that strip of agricultural track northeast of Kupiansk will be visible in satellite imagery for months. The scorched ground, the shattered turrets, the track marks of vehicles that never reversed, they are a permanent record of what happened in those 4 pre-dawn hours. OSINT analysts will continue to refine the account. Unit designations may become clearer as more intercepts are published. The exact toll in crew casualties may never be precisely known. What is known, confirmed by imagery and intercept, and the patient reconstruction of Ukrainian military sources and independent analysts, is this: 18 T-72B3 tanks committed to a channelized assault along a pre-registered kill zone. 12 destroyed or abandoned, 6 withdrew, 0 Ukrainian Stugna-P systems lost, 0 Ukrainian FPV relay teams lost. A battalion's worth of Russian armor consumed in 4 hours along 2.1 kilometers of frozen farmland. If this kind of detailed OSINT investigation, the reconstruction of engagements from satellite imagery, drone footage, intercepted communications, and unit-level analysis is what keeps you coming back, subscribe to Frontline Truth. We produce these breakdowns weekly, and every one of them is built from the same foundation: open-source evidence, verified sources, and the conviction that understanding what actually happens on this front matters more than any official narrative from either side. The track northeast of Kupiansk is quiet now, at least until the next column forms up. But in the hard ground and the scattered wreckage, the lesson of that pre-dawn engagement is written plainly. Whether Russia's operational planners will read it before they commit the next 18 tanks to another channelized corridor remains, for now, the defining question of this axis and of this war.